everyone. And again, I want to thank the organizer for inviting us to present our project. We're very grateful for this opportunity. And we're reaching a stage with Damiano of this project where we're starting finally to digest the data set and to understand what kind of things we have. And this is the moment where I think feedback is the most important, because we actually have time and space to integrate the feedback and to really improve the paper. So we're counting on you to be harsh and to be engaged on this and to ask the questions. So the effect of foreign media on international migration, the case of Italian TV in Albania. As the title mentioned, we're going to speak about Albania. And since Albania is a relatively little known country, we thought it would be good to start this presentation with kind of a historical reminder of what has Albania gone through in the 20th century and more recently. So Albania in the Second World War was occupied by the fascist Italians, then by the German Nazi, and was finally liberated by the communists. And one of the communist leaders, Enver Hoxha, in 1944, upon liberation, installed a Stalinist regime. So it was a very hard dictatorship that Enver Hoxha installed, and it was characterized by heavy political persecution and frequent purges, denunciations. There was no political freedom in Albania during the dictatorship. Under his rule, the country was sealed from the outside, so it was impossible to migrate, near impossible to migrate from Albania to other countries, and the borders were hermetically closed also to cultural goods. Also within the country, it was very complicated to migrate. The regime of Enver Hoxha lasted for a very long time, more than 40 years. Enver Hoxha died in the middle of the 80s, in 85, leaving behind him a country that was in ruins. Economically, the situation was very dire. After the regime, after his death, the regime kind of survived a bit for 5-6 years, and his successors had to struggle with a lot of political turmoil, because as the Eastern Bloc in Europe was crumbling, there was some contagion to Albanian politics, and there was demand for political freedom in Albania. After political protests towards the end of the 90s, the regime gave way, new parties were allowed to emerge, and elections to be held. And in 1991, there was the first election that the Communist Party won, but still, it was the beginning of a new era for Albania. One of the most defining moments of the 90s in Albania is the fact that after the fall of the regime, when people were allowed to leave Albania finally, a lot of people did so. So in the 90s and in the 2000s, the numbers that we have, and the data is not extremely precise, is that around 800,000 Albanians emigrated in the space of 15 to 20 years. So to put that into perspective, the population of Albania is around 3.5 million. So it's close to 20%, 25% of the population that emigrated in the space of 10, 15 years. Most of the Albanians that emigrated went to Greece, to Italy, and then to other destinations such as the US and the UK. So for the sake of this paper, what is going to be of interest for us is the fact that the country was not fully closed. There were some cultural goods that were kind of reaching Albania through the form of TV signal and radio signal. They were arriving from Greece, from neighborhood country, but in this country, we're going to focus on the TV signal that was arriving from Italia. In 1957, the Italian RAI, which is the Italian state television, built an antenna, a transmitter to cover Puglia, which is the most proximate region in Italy that is very close to Albania. And the signal unintentionally reached Albania. What we know from the data that we have is that around 10% of the population was exposed to the signal and was able to watch Italian television. So we're going to exploit this unique setting to ask the following question. It's a common idea in Albania, in Italy, that Italian TV was influential in increasing immigration wave, but this idea was never tested quantitatively. So in this paper, we are going to test this idea. Did Italian TV contribute to the migration waves? And if so, by how much? How much of the immigration that ensued was actually due to Italian television? We want to know whether this effect was heterogeneous across social class. If we think about the marginal migrant that went away from Albania, because of the Italian television, what is this marginal migrants? Is that the most educated, the least educated, the richer? Who knows? We want to identify the mechanisms behind the migration. And in this presentation, the mechanism that we're going to push forward is the one of language proficiency. So we're going to wonder Did language proficiency in Italian increase because of this exposure to Italian television? And is this sizable enough to explain the migration that we observe? And finally, we want to assess whether the subsequent emigration and the subsequent change in human capital that was due to the exposure to Italian television had any effect on growth. So here, there could be contrasting effect. On the one hand, it's possible that people left because of Italian TV, reducing population, reducing potential for growth. On the other hand, there are remittances coming over because people left, and human capital might have been increased from this exposure to Italian television in the form of language proficiency. To answer these questions, we have at our disposal 3 databases. Here, I'm going to go quickly over the data on the methodology in the introduction, then I'll come back in deeper details afterwards. So the 3 data sets that we have is a survey, a geographically representative survey of Albanians that was led in 2005 and that asks a lot of retrospective questions about the situations of respondents in 1990. And we're going to exploit this survey to estimate whether Albanians left because of the exposure to Italian television. We obtained from RaiWay, which is the company that deals with the antenna of Rai, a geographically referenced Italian television strength map of Albania. So for each pixel in Albania, we know if they were receiving television. And we built, using NASA satellite images and machine learning, land cover time series of Albania from 1986 to 2002. So for each pixel of land in Albania, we know for each year whether it was urban or not. And we're going to use this data set to try and identify the causal effect of Italian television on social outcomes. I'm going to spend more time later to convince you that the effects we estimate are indeed causal. But here I just want to say, we'll try to make a good job of explaining that no selection was involved in the access of Italian TV. From any side, there was no self-selection into watching and no selection from the Italian television company into Albania. And then we're going to use proper control to try and identify the effects of residual variations in signal cover due to idiosyncratic factors of the terrain. Just a preview of the results. We find that Italian TV had no effect on the overall emigration rates. So we do not observe that the overall emigration rate out of Albania into Italia was actually increased by exposure to Italian TV. However, we do estimate interesting heterogeneity. The first one being that the individuals which we can identify as being the one endowed with the higher human capital were pushed into leaving to Italy, and the individual endowed with the higher economic capital were also pushed into going to Italy. So in a sense, the data and our results suggest that the Italian TV kind of exaggerated the brain drain out of Albania into Italy. We identify what we think is one of the most important mechanisms behind this immigration is that exposure to treatment increased substantially Italian proficiency. Moving from a municipality with no Italian television access to a municipality with 100% of the area covered in Italian television access corresponds to an increase in 7 percentage points in Italian proficiency, which is big since the average Italian proficiency in Albania was around 5 percentage points in 1990. Then we estimate the effects in terms of city growth. We use our land cover time series to see if the cities that were exposed to Italian TV signal grew more or less than their counterparts that were not exposed. And we find that cities with access to Italian TV grew much less than the cities with no such access. And we think this constitutes a good proxy for economic development. But I'll come back in greater details on these results. So about the literature, we hope with this paper to make first and foremost a contribution on the literature on the impact of media on social outcome. So it's a very deep literature, and it has shown time and again how media can have very wide-ranging and far-reaching impacts on our social behaviors, from impacts on political preferences. And here, there's a paper very close to ours in terms of setting, which is the one of Durante and co-authors, that was written in 2019, which is about how Mediaset, the television of Berlusconi, increased the vote for Berlusconi and the vote for Movimento 5 Stelle after the end of the Berlusconi era. There were effects of media that were found on gender norms. Just to cite one, the paper of Kearney and Levin on MTV, on the show of MTV 16 and Pregnant, show that exposure to this show reduced teen pregnancy rates, and also on many other dimensions. media shapes migration waves, has received comparatively little attention. So there are some papers, and there are two important papers here in the literature. The first one is a working paper by Michela Braga that was written in 2007 on the context of Albania, and one by Fare and Fazani. But they typically considered outcomes that are different to ours. For example, the paper of Fare and Fazani considers internal migration rates in Indonesia and look at how exposure to television impacted those internal migration rates, and find that exposure to Indonesian television reduced internal migration rates. They hypothesize that this reduction is due to an informational channel that makes it so that people realize that the returns of emigrations are lower than the ones they expected. So we contribute to this literature by finding effects on international migration, which have not been found already in the literature, by finding effects on language proficiency that constitute the mechanism behind this immigration, and by finding effects on growth, as proxied by city size. We are also related to three other literature, and two strands of literature to which we try to contribute. The first one I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, is focused on the Albanian immigration waves. It's a literature that's mainly made out of history paper and sociology paper, but I try to document and evaluate and explain the Albanian immigration waves. Because the data that we have is quite poor, most of these studies are not quantitative or rely on small surveys, and really set the groundwork for us to understand what happened during those immigration waves. With our paper, we hope to contribute by bringing that quantitative evidence on the size of the influence of Italian television to the immigration wave. We also contribute to the literature on language and cultural barrier to migration. Here, I think the most relevant paper is the one by Atsera and Petlikova. They show in 2015 that immigration to OECD countries can be very well predicted by the language proximity between home countries and destination countries. And in our paper, we have a setting that allows us to estimate in a causal framework how much language proficiency can be important for immigration. So we believe we also have somewhat of a contribution to make to this literature. And of course, throughout the work we did on that paper, we drew guidance and inspiration from the model of Borjas in 1987, and Borjas and co-author in 2018 about the self-selection of migrants into immigration. Who are those migrants that are pushed into migration by the treatment that we individualize here? So that's it for the introduction. I'm going to present the data in greater detail, and that will be the occasion also to show the historical background. I'll come back more on identification and try to convince you that what we have is a setting that allows to infer causality, and then I'll explain the results. So as I mentioned, we have three datasets. The first one is the World Bank Albania Living Standard Measurement Survey. So it's a survey that was conducted by the World Bank together with the Albanian Statistical Agency in 2005. It interrogates, it surveys a geographically representative sample of the population made out of 17,000 individuals in 480 cities throughout Albania. Mostly interesting for us, the questions that were asked to these respondents are about their location of residence in 1990. That allows us to trace back what was their treatment in 1990, their foreign language proficiency in 1990, whether they could speak Italian, Greek, English, or else, their parents' education, and this will allow us to identify how endowed they were with cultural capital and human capital. It's the best proxy we could find. And the size of their dwellings in 1990, which we're going to use as a proxy for wealth. So the idea here is the less persons per bedroom a family has, the richer it was. Since we don't have a lot of indicators in the survey of how rich people were in 1990, this is what we decided to use. We can kind of try to correlate these measures to other variables that we have, and they tend to match what we think. So for example, the number of persons per room is negatively correlated with the subjective wealth of individuals. So respondents are also asked about what was their wealth situation in 1990 from 1 to 10, 10 being the best, 1 the worst. And we see the negative correlation that we expect. We also have data, believe it or not, on the quality of the toilets in 1990. And also here it correlates in the direction that we think it should. The same goes with the quality of the dwellings. So it's not the perfect proxy for wealth, but we believe it does the job, and the results also indicates in that direction. So of course, this sample is a selected sample because these are all people that are living in Albania in 2005. So none of them actually migrated. What we do to circumvent this issue is that these respondents are also asked to list all of their siblings and whether their siblings are currently living abroad or in Albania. So we create this alternative sample, which is a sample of siblings, which is made out of 27,888 observations. And for these siblings, we have their country of residence and the date of departure when they went abroad. We can assume they were living in the same places as the respondent in 1990. And for these individuals, we thus know their treatment, their further education, and where they live right now. And we're going to use this sample to perform the analysis on migration. So a bit about this sample. Who are those migrants? We can decompose the sample of the sibling and look at their endowments in human capital and economic capital, given whether they migrated or did not migrate. So for example, in the first column of further education, we have the levels of further education for the sibling that remain in Albania and for the sibling that went abroad. What we observe is that the further education of the siblings that were abroad is significantly higher than the one that stayed in Albania. They tend to be more educated, they went more to primary school and more to more than primary school. This is a pattern that is mirrored by the data on mother education, and a pattern that is mirrored by the data on respondents' education. So whenever a respondent is listing their sibling, we can look at the respondent's education and see if it also matches whatever the father education, mother education pattern is. Interesting, what we find is that on average, the people that left abroad had smaller houses than the people that decided to stay in Albania. We can also ask the question of the pattern of immigration. What's the timing of the immigration flows? So here we plot the immigration flows outside of Albania from 1987 to 2004. So from this graph emerge a few patterns. First, we can see that immigration really started to pick up after 1995. Whereas in the beginning, at the fall of the dictatorship in 1990, it remains at quite low level. The immigration towards Italy in particular really occurs towards the end of the sample. In the graph, we put 4 vertical lines that correspond to 4 moments coined by the literature on the Albanian immigration wave. The first one is the end of the dictatorship. The second one is the moment where it became legal to actually go away from Albania. The third one corresponds to an economic crisis. So in the 90s, there was a bubble that was being built, based on the pyramid scheme that Albanians saving were absorbed in a. Oh, I see someone is raising their hand. Should I?
No, you can finish your sentence, Anatole, and then I'll ask the question.
I'm sorry.
Can you hear me? I was saying you should finish your sentence. I didn't mean to.
No. But go for it. Go for it.
Well, I was just going to ask you. I guess one thing that I thought maybe, if I understood correctly, is that you won't have in your sample any if all extended families. If me and all my siblings migrate from Albania, I'm not going to be in your data. Is that kind of correct?
It's totally correct. Yes.
And I'm wondering if you should be worried. I mean, I guess I might be worried that those might be the early migrants. I mean, I guess it would be interesting. There must be data from some of these countries on the other side, like the Italian side, to try to see if your figures match up well with how many Albanians were kind of measured coming to Italy in this time period.
So we're trying to get some data on the Italian side and the Greek side, but so far it has proved complicated, and we couldn't find a database that's already there.
So that is part of the problem.
Yeah, but definitely it's something that we keep in mind, and I was going to talk about it a bit later on in the presentation, but this is one of the part of the selection of a sample that we cannot really address. In fact, we miss those families that migrated altogether.
Yeah, and I might think that they were the maybe most rich and they're the ones that probably are more likely to go early in a sense. They felt they had the ability to all leave. Maybe. I mean, it's very hard to know actually, but I could see
it could totally be. Yeah. Unfortunately, yeah. We can try and investigate the literature a bit more to see if we can find anything on that. Thank you. So as I was mentioning, there was a big financial crisis in 1997 that really brought the economy to its knee, a lot of political unrest in 1997, and massive immigration ensued. And this immigration was further increased by the Kosovo crisis in 1999, whereby, because of the crisis in Kosovo, many Albanians living in Kosovo emigrated back to Albania and then again to Italy and Greece. And around 1999, the political asylum status was given to Albanians coming from the Kosovo area. So a lot more permits were given for migration, and immigration rates really started to pick up. As to the composition of this immigration, what we know from the literature is that the first half of these migrants are usually young, educated males that went away from Albania the first, whereas the second half is much more diverse. There are more women, and it's not only the educated that went away from Albania. So for every point of observation of the sibling sample, we don't know exactly where they live, but we can trace that back their municipalities. So what's important for us is to know what's the treatment at the municipality level. So we took the signal strength data and we aggregated it at the municipality level. And for each municipality, we know what was the share of the land that was under signal, and that will be our treatment. So in this map, we can see every municipality of Albania and see how much they were treated. So as we see, most of the treatment is concentrated on the West Coast because the one that is the closest to Italy, but the propagation of the signal is neither linear nor monotonous. We can see that the signal is bouncing around and is reaching places that are further behind Albania, also because Albania is quite a mountainous terrain, and towards the east there are more mountains. So it happened that some municipalities on the middle side of Albania are more treated than some in the middle here. I want to anticipate any concern that we don't have enough variance when we move away from Italy with this graph. In here, we plot the mean proportion of exposure to TV signal by deciles of the distance to Italy, the distance to the nearest port, and the elevation. And this graph is here to try and convince you that, in fact, we do have the most variance in the first decile, so the part that is closest to Italy, but we do also have variance when we move away. So we're going to be exploiting this variance to say something about treatment, about the effect of treatment. We also built this land cover series to track for each pixel of Albania, whether it's urban or not, from 1984 to 2005. I don't want to enter too much into the details of how we constructed such a map, but I'll try to do it a bit quickly. So we collected NASA satellite images from the Landsat 5 thematic mapper satellite for each year from 1984 to 2005. And we basically aggregated this data into polygons of similar pixels, so as to not have to classify each pixel individually, because that's over 7 million pixels per year, and there's a lot of variance. And we use this method that is considered as the one that works the best in the literature on Landsat classification, which is called object-based classification. So instead of classifying the pixel in the map, we classify groups of pixels, and that helps the classifier. We augmented our data here with ancillary data such as elevation, vegetation, to kind of track better where are the cities, where are the forests, and where are the rivers. Then we manually selected segments of the map, and we classified them by hand. So we collected over 48,000 samples. It was a very painstaking work. And we estimated a machine learning model, a support vector machine on this data, which gives out a precision and a recall that we are quite happy about, which is around 80% for both. So our map is not without error, but it's sufficiently precise that we can actually see through the noise to what happened underneath. And in any case, whatever error we have should be orthogonal to the Italian TV signal. So we're not concerned that the error we have on our map is something else than an attenuation bias of our results. So now that I've covered the data, I want to convince you that what we have is actually a causal framework. So we think it's a causal framework because First, there was no selection involved at any stage in this unique setting. The transmitter was built in Puglia and was meant to serve the Puglian need. There was no targeting of specific Albanian subpopulation. It was not a propaganda warfare. And in any case, there was no information about what population to target in Albania. So here we have a completely unintentional treatment in a way. We know that internal migration was controlled by the regime of Enver Hoxha, so there was no self-selection to treatment. It's not that people were able to migrate to capture television. And qualitative evidence indicates that Albanians were watching Italian television. And we also know that around 61% of Albanian households had a television in 1990, which indicates that they had the means to connect, switch on the TV, and actually watch Italian television. So what we believe is that with proper control, we can identify the effects from residual variation in signal cover due to the idiosyncratic factors within narrow areas. And more formally, we estimate the following regression equation. So the outcome Y is measured at the individual level. So often it will be the siblings of municipality M of district D. The outcome we're going to consider are mostly binary outcome, 1 or 0, whether being abroad or not, whether knowing Italian in 1990 or not, whether receiving remittances. And we're going to also use the same setting when we estimate the effects on city growth.
Yeah. Just to let you know that you have about 10 minutes left.
Okay. I'll try to speed up. So we estimate this on the treatment at the municipality level. Was the share of the municipality that's covered in TV signal. We use district fixed effects, such that what we capture are the effect of variation in the TV signal within the district between the municipalities. So the variant here, we have a very restrictive kind of specification, since we just want to compare municipalities within the same district, which really helps to mitigate that whatever we capture is just proximity to Italy. And then we add a vector of geographic controls with the distance to Italy, nearest port city, transmitter, ruggedness, and elevation. The first regression we're going to estimate is simply on whether the respondent siblings are abroad or in Albania. Importantly, we're not going to augment the sample of siblings with the sample of respondents, because the sample of respondents is a very selected sample of the population, since these are people that all stayed in Italy. And the sample of the sibling is much less so a selected sample, since, as we mentioned, we cannot get the families that emigrated entirely, but we hope it represents a small sample of these families. One one small issue that we can control for of a sample is that it tends to represent big families. For a family of 7, we have 7 points in the sample. For a family of 2, we have 2. So we need to pay attention to that and control for this. And finally, our sample also cannot contain Albanians that do not have any siblings. However, it's a small share of the population. From the survey, it's only 4%. So without further ado, let's move to the results. So what we estimate here is one observation is 1 sibling. The outcome is 1 or 0. If 1 if abroad, 0 if still in Albania. So it's a linear probability model, OLS. And the first column of this graph, of this table, we estimate whether TV signal increased the priority to emigrate of siblings. And the result that we find is a null effect. So when we consider overall immigration rate, we do not find evidence of an impact of TV signal on the priority to emigrate. However, when we consider subsamples of the population, such as dividing the population in terms of the number of persons per room, which as I tried to show you before, could be understood as a proxy for wealth, we find heterogeneous effects. We find that the first tercile of the population in terms of number of persons per room was significantly affected by TV signal exposure. Moving from a municipality in which there is no TV signal exposure to a municipality that is fully exposed, increased immigration rate by 17.7 percentage points of this category of the population. So a very sizable effect, but we do not find on the persons that are less endowed in economic capital. As to sibling education, we use it to measure the level of endowment in cultural and human capital of the siblings. We find that those siblings who were nominated by a head of household or spouse that has gone to university are much more likely to go to Italy and to go abroad if they were under the TV signal. And here the effect of this is of 24.4 percentage points, so extremely sizable. We take this table as evidence that there was something resembling a brain drain that was provoked by the Italian TV exposure. One question that arises here is that just an effect? People are they just going abroad, or are they actually going to Italy? So rather than redoing the same estimation with Italy, let's just consider those persons that are endowed in economic capital and those persons that are endowed in human capital. On the first two columns, the outcome variable is whether being in Italy or not being in Italy. And we find a strong effect. So less significant, statistically speaking, than the one we found earlier, but still very sizable economically speaking. We find that those people endowed with those capital actually migrated to Italy, whereas the effects on their migration to Greece are not significant.
Anatole?
Yeah.
There's a question by Joel Machlano about like the effect in time, sort of like of TV signal. So do you consider that TV signal affects migration at any time after like the household has access to his TV signal, or do you limit it to a subset of years? So I guess is the effect on the long time scale?
So is the time of being treated matters, is the question, if I understood correctly?
Yeah, I think the question is more about so having a TV signal, does it increase right after the migration, like the propensity to migrate, or is the effect the same like five years later?
So actually, that's the best transition I could think of for the next graph, because that's exactly what we looked at. Wondering whether the TV signal pushed immigration in the early 90s or in the late 90s, which is the question, right? If I understood correctly.
Yeah, okay. So Joel says yes.
Okay. So in the first two columns here, we reproduce kind of the regression we showed one table earlier. And the outcome variable is one, if a person migrated before 1995 not included, zero otherwise, and the two other column is one after 1995, zero otherwise. And we find that the effect of Italian television is especially strong, I mean, is only strong in the first part. So to come back to what we were talking about earlier also, we know that Italian TV had an effect on these early migrants, but not on these late migrants. This matters a lot for what we're going to say afterwards about the economic impact of Italian TV signal. As to the interpretation of why this is the case, we still need to investigate a bit to understand. If there are ideas, we're happy to discuss them. So now we wonder about the mechanism behind this effect. Why do we observe this heterogeneity, and what happens? Why do people emigrate? I'm going to try to speed up and I'll to meet the time schedule. So we estimate the effect of TV signal exposure on language proficiency in 1990. However, we don't have language proficiency in 1990 for the siblings. So here we look at the respondents, meaning the people that are living in Albania in 2005. Here again, it's a selected sample. So we believe those people, the estimation of the effect on those people is a lower bound of the true effect. The people that migrated because of Italian TV most likely learned Italian more than the people that stayed behind. These are the effects of, our estimates. So in the first column, we estimate on the general sample, and here the outcome variable takes value 1 if the person knows Italian in 1990 and 0 otherwise. So the baseline effect that we find is 6.7 percentage point increase when moving from a non-exposed municipality to a fully exposed municipality. It's an economically sizable effect, since it's more than the mean proficiency in Albania. Interestingly, when we decompose for the heterogeneity to look at the people endowed in economic capital and cultural capital, we do not find the same pattern as before. So we don't find that the people most endowed in economic capital learned Italian more. We are trying to investigate this result that could also be due simply to a compositional effect, to the fact that all of those people that were endowed with economic capital that learned Italian because of the Italian TV actually went away. But we need to find some more data here to kind of understand better what's going on. The results here on further education, meaning on the endowments in cultural capital, are much more convincing because we find very, very sizable effect of 25.6 percentage point in language proficiency for the people that were endowed in cultural capital, which supports the idea that these people left because they learned Italian, and it became more interesting to leave to Italy thanks to that. We conducted placebo tests to make sure that there's no effect on learning Greek, learning English, and we found no results there. So now we turn to the estimation of the economic effect of the TV signal exposure. We know there was a brain drain, but we know language proficiency increased. What happened for those cities that were exposed to the Italian TV signal? Well, there are two variables of interest that we can look at. The first one are the remittances, and the second one is city area growth, or proxy for development. Since we know that population emigration was not affected as a whole, it was only substrate of the population, we know the city growth or lack of growth is not due to a population change, since emigration rate did not change. So if we see that population growth is increased by Italian TV signal, it could be due to improved human capital thanks to the fact that people are now speaking Italian, or it could be due to increased remittances. If those cities grew less than the others that were not exposed, that means that the effect was negative because of the brain drain. So first, we start with the effect on remittances. And here we have the quantity of remittances received by respondents in the past year, and we estimate our baseline equation regression on whether the respondents that are living in municipalities in which there is TV signal receive more or less remittances. And what we find is a positive, albeit non-significant effect when considering all remittances. And we find that this lack of statistical significance comes from the remittances of spouse and children. But when we consider other relatives, we do find a statistically significant increase in remittances of 85 euros on average, which is a sizable amount when considering Albania in 2005, when considering the economy of Albania in 2005. So with these results in hand, we move to our last estimation, which is the estimation on city growth. And here, an observation is a city at a given year. And our outcome variable is the year-on-year growth rate of that city for that given year. So that is censored at 0 because we don't observe city degrowing, we only observe city growth.
Anatole, I think you should you should conclude now, but maybe we can come back to these results in the discussion.
Sure. So we here just in one word, we find that the cities that were exposed to Italian TV signal grew much less than their counterparts that were not affected. So let me conclude on that. What we identify here in this paper is a strong positive causal effect of Italian television on the exposure on the immigration of Albanians with university-educated siblings, which means the one that were most likely endowed with the human capital, the immigration of Albanians from the richer backgrounds, and we find sizable effect of Italian language proficiency, which we believe constitutes the mechanism behind the immigration. And the evidence suggests bad effects for long-term growth of the zones that were impacted, because we measure lower city area growth for the cities that were exposed, although the remittances are increased. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Anatole, for this really interesting presentation. So now it's time for the Q&A part of the seminar. So if you have any questions, you can just raise your virtual hand, and I will allow you to unmute and ask your questions directly. So actually, I have a question. I think that the parts of Albania that have access, that were more covered by the Italian signal, are just next to the sea, right? I mean, it's on the close to the coast.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if it's not why you find a lower urban development for the cities that have the signal, because by definition, if they are just next to the sea, they have less space also to expand. So I'm wondering if it's just not because of the geography that they cannot that you find this effect.
That's an interesting point. So the cities that are exposed to Italian TV, I mean, let me put the map. Maybe we can see it better from here. In the region, in the municipalities that are the most exposed, which are this group, there are actually not that many coastal cities except for Vlore here, which is on the south part, which actually grew by a lot in the period. So it could be that those cities are constrained. We could potentially just control that by adding some more controls in the city regression. So distance to sea rather than distance to ports. And this way we could have an indicator whether the city is on the sea. That's a good point. We'll definitely try this.
Okay, so are there other questions in the chat?
Just following a bit of what Etienne was mentioning, I don't know if you have considered also maybe as a robustness to restrict a bit to the municipalities that are in the West, for instance, so that you are sure that you are not just capturing the effect of people who are in the West, somehow more linked to Italy because of that, and that will choose that country once they are able to migrate. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
No, that makes sense. So no, that makes definitely a lot of sense. We hope that with our the equation that we estimate, we are restrictive enough, since we only consider variation between districts, and a district is usually made out of no more than 8 municipalities, that we kind of control for that efficiently. We've tried some specification in which we remove the first deciles of the distance to Italy, and the results are qualitatively similar, but we lose a lot of power because this is where most of the variance is. Yeah. We should have a table ready to show the results for sure. Yeah, but we considered that. Yes, it's a very important point.
Okay, that's a question by Sarah Perlman. So Sarah, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yes, thank you for this. This is a really interesting, or a really cool data set, and interesting question. And I was wondering, in terms of the channels, because this is about information and the extent to which this information is a complement or substitute to existing migration networks. So it could be, a substitute from, if you have the network, the TV doesn't need to tell you about opportunities in Italy, but a complement that if you have the network, then it tells you that watching Italian TV is worthwhile. And so I'm wondering if the differences that you're finding before and after 1995, or maybe a statement about that before 95, where there's no established network, this really is kind of providing the information, but after 95, when there's a bit of a network, it's not mattering as much.
That's a very good point. It's something that we actually were discussing with Damiano yesterday. We're thinking maybe it's something about catching up, that Italian television was important in this earlier moment, but then not so much so because there was more information floating around. So this would tend to point to the idea that the main mechanism is not necessarily language proficiency, but also information. We need to think about ways to address this, to see if it's the community that is now in Italy that transmits this information. And it's not entirely obvious to us how we can do that. But that's a very good point, yes. Now that's definitely a way to frame it.
Okay, there's another question by Annika Kramer. So you can unmute yourself now.
Thanks a lot. I hope you can hear me. So my first question, so I have 2 questions. The first would be to understand a little bit better the variation you're exploiting. So when you go back on the map, I would be interested in, because you're using within district variation, how much districts exist in Albania, how many municipalities are in there, whether they're also clustering then, at the east side. So it would be the first one. And the second question would be, maybe I did not get it correctly from your data points of view. However, when you're always splitting the sample by number of persons in the room, which is your proxy for wealth of the household, you run this analysis on a specific subsample. So it never matches perfectly with the baseline sample. So you split by 2.6 person. And I would be interested in what kind of households these are where you have this information, or whether there are specific individuals who are living in these households where you do have the information.
So on your first question, we have 36 districts in Albania, and we have around, if I remember correctly, around 350 municipalities. So there are about 10 municipalities per district. So we exploit the variation between these groups of 10 municipalities, and we clustered the regression at the municipality level. If I understood, you were wondering about the level of clustering that we were doing, right?
No, I was wondering about the variation you indeed have. So, you know, when you do have a lot of districts, for example, in the north, then you probably will not exploit anything there because there is no municipality treated at all within a district.
Yeah, no, for sure, those districts are, there's no variation for us to exploit in the east and the north, yes. But do you think that causes a problem for the estimation for the results that we have?
No, but I think that you're essentially exploit the variation to the most east and south, and there you also the variation then within districts on municipality level is not that large. You know, for example, if you would have larger districts, for example.
We could try and increase the, I mean, we could take the level of administrative division below the above the district, so to have more there. But this would be at the cost of being a bit less restrictive on the on Italian TV signal being closer to Italy.
Yeah.
But by being so restrictive, it's true that we capture less variation. It would be interesting to try and capture more by having those bigger districts. As to
maybe
your
like labor market regions could be maybe helpful.
That could be a very good idea. I don't know if we can find such a thing as labor market regions for Albania, but definitely gonna try. Can you remind me your second question, please?
Sure. The second question was when you're splitting the sample by number of persons per room, which is the indicator for wealth of the households. It seems that you always have this information only for a specific subsample, and I would be interested in what kind of subsample this is, because when you sum up both subsamples, I think you use the mean of 2.6. This never sums up to the baseline sample.
No,
so the question you were showing, and I'm just wondering whether it's really specific, you know, for a subsample you have this information.
So in fact, I do not know whether the population of the one for which we have this information on the number per person per room and the sample for which we don't have this information, I do not know how they differ. It's something that I need to check. Yes.
I was just wondering, you know, because, you know, the difference is not that tiny. So it's something like a third of the sample you have this information.
Yeah. Yeah.
And therefore it seems to be maybe worth to look into it.
Yeah, no, definitely we should, this is something we should know. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your talk.
Okay, I don't see, Sarah, you still have your hand raised, so I don't know if you have an additional question or not. No, okay.
No.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. I was wondering actually about like this difference of the effect between like before 95 and after 95. If it's not because like after 95, maybe there were more means of information than just this this TV signal. So maybe the effect didn't disappear. Maybe the effect was still present, like for the western part of Albania, but it's just that in other parts they also had more access to information. I don't know. I'm just guessing why you should have a different effect before and after 95.
Now that could also be an explanation. I was also wondering whether, because the first part of the immigration might be, we need to investigate more political in nature than the second part, where you have the economic crisis of 97 and the economic condition is not improving, whereas the first part might be political. So you have this information, the fact that maybe in Italy you can go there and save yourself, kind of, and since you have this information, you flee as soon as possible. Whether And after 95, maybe the stability of Albanian politics is just a little much better, but you wouldn't want to flee away so much. But I'm not sure. Yeah, that's we might need to find a way to explain this puzzle. Yes.
Yeah, and another question, maybe I missed it during the presentation, but so you find that the effect is mostly for like wealthy people, right? But the effect of having a higher propensity to learn Italian is only for like basically poorest people.
So we find, yes, only for the poorest on proficiency, also on the most educated. But here we have this split. So we tried and investigate a bit this split because we actually have somewhat lower quality data on the children and spouse that live outside of the household of the respondents. And for this sample, we know whether they live abroad or in Albania. And we know also their Italian proficiency in 1990. So these are this set of regression where, and here we observe a reversed pattern again, but we actually find a big effect on the rich and no effect on the one that are less wealthy, but no effect on the most educated and an effect on the least educated. And since this data is of much lower quality, also because we can't really distinguish between the children and the spouses, the average proficiency in Italian in 1990 look off the chart. I'm not showing it in the corpus of the presentation, but it definitely asks more questions than it answers.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's very puzzling to have like this effect for children and spouses and the reverse for the household. Okay. I don't see any more questions in the chat.